I always believed a house remembers the way you breathe inside it. It takes the shape of your footsteps, holds your laughter in the corners, and keeps your sorrows tucked under floorboards. 40 years. That's how long I lived inside this house on Renford Lane, believing my quietness kept the peace. I used to think silence was strength. Now I'm not so sure. The morning it happened, the morning Sophie threw the gravy, the light came through the kitchen window in a soft, forgiving gold, the kind that makes dust look like it's dancing. I remember thinking, the day looks gentle today. Funny how the cruelest moments always arrive dressed in gentle light. The kettle clicked itself off behind me, and I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator, like an old friend trying to tell me something. I had woken early, as I always did, careful not to disturb anyone. At 60 years old, habits cling to you like a second skin. You move softly, you breathe lighter, you exist in the spaces where no one is looking, especially when it's easier for everyone if you stay unseen. I placed the breakfast tray on the counter, eggs, toast, tea, and waited for the footsteps overhead. They always came in the same order. First Sophie, then Michael, then the rest of the house. That morning, the footsteps were sharper, more rushed, more irritated. I could tell even before she spoke. Sophie entered the kitchen with the same expression she always carried around me, like she was tired of something she never said aloud. Her hair was tied tight, her eyes colder than the tile floor, her voice sharp enough to cut butter. "You didn't heat this properly," she said, lifting the saucepan of gravy. Her words weren't loud. She didn't need volume. Her tone always carried enough punishment. I turned, slowly, gently, like someone used to moving through accusations instead of air. "I'm sorry, dear," I whispered. "I'll warm it again." But she didn't want it warmed, not really. She wanted something else. The kind of satisfaction people take from breaking someone who doesn't fight back. She lifted the saucepan with one hand, her grip firm, her knuckles pale. Before I could step back, speak again, breathe, she flung it. A wave of boiling gravy cut through the air, fast and furious, and it splashed across my cheek, my chin, my neck. The heat was blinding, sharp, alive, like a swarm of bees stinging the same spot all at once. I gasped, not from the pain, but from the shock that this was finally happening. The house went quiet. Even the refrigerator seemed to hold its breath. My hand flew to my face, and the skin screamed beneath my fingertips. I could feel the trembling start in my shoulders, the way old wood shakes before falling apart. Sophie didn't look at me, not even once. She set the empty saucepan on the counter as though she had simply spilled water, nothing more. "You should have been careful," she said. Her voice was cold, her eyes colder, and for the first time in years, I didn't shrink. I didn't bow my head. I didn't whisper apologies into the quiet. The pain on my face burned. But something else burned deeper, something older, something I had kept buried under years of swallowed words. I straightened my back. The room swayed a little. Not from weakness, but from everything I had held inside rising, rising, rising. My voice came out low, cracked, but steady enough to surprise even me. "Where is Michael?" Sophie's shoulders stiffened. She didn't like when I used his name directly. She liked when I said, "your husband," as if he belonged only to her. "He's upstairs," she said curtly, "getting ready for work. Don't disturb him." But pain has a way of clearing the fog in your bones. I stepped past her, my hand still pressed to my face, feeling the skin throb under the burn. Each step felt like reclaiming something I'd been made to forget: my dignity, my right to exist in my own home, my voice that had rusted from disuse. The stairs creaked under my feet, each groan of old wood sounding like the house urging me on. When I reached the landing, I paused. Not from doubt, but from a strange, sudden calm that settled over me. For 60 years I had lived gently. I had forgiven easily. I had endured quietly. But this was not something a mother should have to endure under her own roof. I stood outside Michael's door. My hand hovered above the wood. My breath trembled in my chest. Not from fear, but from the realization that everything in my life might change with this one knock, or with the words I was about to say. I didn't knock. Instead, I turned away, walked down the hallway, and entered the small spare room, the one Sophie always told me not to use, the one she said was messy, though she never allowed me to clean it. I walked to the bedside table and picked up the phone. My fingers shook as I pressed the familiar numbers. My son's number. The number I had dialed 1,000 times before, only to say nothing real, nothing true. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then, "Mum?" His voice, uncertain, sleepy, concerned in the way only a child's voice can be, even when the child is a grown man who's forgotten how to see you. I swallowed. The words tasted strange on my tongue, heavy and sharp. "Michael," I whispered. Her name trembled behind my teeth. Gravy. Pain. Sophie. "Mum, are you all right?" I closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't hide the tremor in my voice. "No," I said. Just that one word. No excuses, no softening, no silence. Just truth. And everything changed. Michael didn't speak for a moment. I could hear his breath soften on the other end of the line, like he was sitting up straighter. Like something in my voice had reached through the phone and pulled him awake. "Mum, what happened?" The question was simple, but it felt like someone opening a door that had been locked for far too long. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, the kind of silence that carries years of swallowed pain. My hand trembled against my cheek, the burn throbbing under my fingertips. The gravy had already dried on my skin, turning the pain into a slow, angry fire. I could smell it still. The faint, bitter scent of something cooked too long, something mishandled, something thrown. I let out a shaky breath. "Come home," I whispered. Those 2 words came out softer than I expected, but stronger than anything I had ever said to him. There was no anger in them, no accusation, just a quiet, exhausted plea. "Mum, did Sophie—" I closed my eyes. He already knew. Children always know, even when they pretend not to. "Come home," I repeated, my voice barely above a breath. He inhaled sharply, the sound tight and troubled. The silence between us thickened, like fog gathering over a cold field. "I'm on my way," he said. The phone clicked, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone in that house. I placed the phone back gently, my fingers lingering on it as if it had suddenly become a lifeline. Something warm in a place that had long turned cold. When I stepped out of the room, the hallway felt different. The light had shifted, softer but heavier, as though the house was listening now, truly listening. My feet carried me down the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the quiet like a heartbeat. In the kitchen, Sophie stood with her back to me, washing the empty saucepan. Her movements were sharp, irritated, purposeful, as if she were scrubbing away evidence. She didn't turn when she heard me enter. The sink hissed as hot water ran over metal. Steam rose in thin, ghostly wisps around her face. For a moment, I watched her hands, small, precise, restless. Hands that had just thrown boiling liquid at another human being. Hands that had never learned softness. She spoke without looking up. "You should clean yourself up. Michael will be downstairs soon." Her voice was calm, almost bored. It struck me then how easily cruelty becomes routine for some people. I didn't answer her, not because I was afraid, not because I wanted to keep the peace, but because some silences are no longer about fear. They are about power. I walked past her, the burn on my cheek pulsing with each heartbeat. The air in the kitchen felt thick, as if every surface knew the truth of what had happened. As I moved toward the sink to wash my face, Sophie finally glanced at me. Her eyes widened, just for a second, when she saw the angry red burn spreading across my cheek and jaw. But it wasn't guilt I saw in her face. It was fear. Fear of what this moment might cost her. Fear of what Michael might say. Fear of what I might finally be willing to speak aloud. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Not accusations, not excuses, just a long, unfinished breath. I ran cool water over a cloth and pressed it to my skin. The burn hissed under the touch, a sharp sting shooting down my neck. But pain feels different when it has purpose. When it finally pushes you toward truth instead of silence. I heard the front door open then, fast, urgent, louder than anything in that house had sounded in years. Michael's footsteps rushed across the wooden floor. "Mum!" He appeared in the doorway, his tie still half knotted, his coat unbuttoned, his hair uncombed. His eyes found my face, and everything in him changed. The shock, the horror, the anger that rose like a storm behind his eyes. "What happened?" he breathed, stepping closer. But before I could speak, before any explanation could form, his gaze slid past me and landed on Sophie. She froze. The kitchen fell silent. The kind of silence that comes right before a truth breaks open. Michael's voice dropped, low and sharp like a blade drawn slowly. "Sophie, what did you do?" She tightened her grip on the countertop, her knuckles whitening. It was an accident," she said quickly. "She shouldn't have—" He didn't let her finish. "Don't," he said. A single word, cold and final. Sophie swallowed hard. Her breath hitched. Her eyes darted to me, then back to him, as if searching for a version of the world where she could lie her way through this. But that world had ended the moment the gravy left her hand. Michael stepped to my side, gently touching my elbow, guiding me away from the sink as though I might fall. "Mum, you're coming with me," he said. His voice had softened, but underneath it, a storm was forming. Sophie took a step forward. "Michael." He turned, slow and sharp. "Don't follow us." That was the moment the house felt truly silent. The kind of silence that marks the end of something, or the beginning. Maybe both. I let him guide me toward the front door, my steps steady, my breath slow. The cold air outside stung my cheek, but not as much as the pain I had carried for years inside those walls. As the door closed behind us, I realized something. This wasn't the day I broke. This was the day I refused to stay broken. And for the first time in a long time, the world outside felt big enough to hold me again. I've always believed that houses remember everything. Not just the sounds we make, but the silences we carry, the words we swallow, the anger we hide behind polite nods and soft footsteps. This house on Renford Lane had been mine longer than most things I owned, longer than my husband had lived, longer than Michael had been a child, longer than any memory that wasn't tied to me. And in its walls, I had kept my patience, carefully folded like linens in the closet, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice that patience wasn't infinite. The morning after the gravy, the house felt the same. The light came through the kitchen blinds in thin slats, painting lines across the floor. I could hear the kettle humming, a comforting, lonely sound. But everything else, the furniture, the walls, the staircase, felt heavier somehow. As if it, too, had witnessed the moment where patience broke and remembered it. I went to the small sitting room, the one with the faded sofa that had once been new and bright. The cushions were flattened from years of use, the fabric thin where hands and elbows had pressed too often. I sank into it, letting my body remember how to settle without tension. My cheek still stung from the hot gravy. Every movement made it throb, a sharp reminder that what we endure eventually finds a way out. I touched it gently, tracing the path of the spill. The red mark was faint now, but it carried the weight of years, decades of small violences that had added up, little by little. The silent moments Sophie had enjoyed, the little jabs, the words she didn't say but implied. All of it lived in that burn. I thought about Michael then, not just the man he had become, the son I had raised, the husband he was supposed to be, but the boy I had held in my arms after long days of work, the child who had never seen me weak. I wondered how long it had been since he had really looked at me, not glanced, not asked, not smiled politely, but really seen me. For years, I had let things slide. Sophie's sharp words, her impatience, her little rules she imposed in my home as though I were a visitor. I had let them slide. I had avoided confrontation because I believed it kept the peace. I had smiled, nodded, done what I could, spoken less than my heart wanted, because silence had been easier than anger. But the gravy had changed that. It was sudden, violent, and irreversible. And in that moment, I had realized that silence had not protected me. It had imprisoned me. I reached for the window, the thin glass warm from the morning sun. Outside, the garden lay quiet. The roses had begun to bloom, delicate and red, stubborn against the frost that lingered in the corners. I watched a single bird hop along the fence, pecking at something invisible. It moved with purpose, and somehow I envied it. The phone call I had made to Michael replayed in my mind. I remembered the hesitation in my hand as I dialed, the tremble in my fingers, the way my chest had tightened as I waited for him to answer. I had whispered the words that could have changed everything. Come home. I had never been so raw, so exposed, but I had done it. I closed my eyes and let the memory of the conversation wash over me. His voice had been tentative at first, sleepy, almost unaware, but it had grown firmer, sharper, protective. I had not spoken of the gravy, not yet. I had only said what I could bear to say, come home. And in that, there was a quiet power I hadn't felt in years, not anger, not revenge, just the certainty that I would not shrink this time. The quiet of the house pressed in on me, heavy but familiar. I could hear the floorboards creak where Sophie had walked, the muffled sounds of her chores, the low hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Each sound felt exaggerated, meaningful, like the house itself was cataloguing everything that had happened and everything that was about to. I remembered other moments, smaller and older. The way Sophie had never smiled at me, not fully, not sincerely. The way she had corrected my hands when I set the table wrong, or commented on the way I brewed tea as though I were incompetent. I remembered nodding, apologizing quietly, retreating into the corner of my own home. I remembered the bitterness of a mother-in-law whose son had married someone who made her feel invisible. I remembered swallowing tears, holding my tongue, letting the injustice become invisible in the quiet. I thought about the years I had spent enduring it. The moments when I had caught Michael's eyes from across the room and seen his awareness, fleeting, of the way Sophie treated me. He had always been torn between his wife and his mother, and I had understood. I had let him go his way, because mothers are supposed to endure, because I had believed love required silence. But the gravy had undone all that, and in its heat I had felt a flame stir inside me that years of politeness had buried. I walked to the kitchen again, slowly, deliberately. I touched the countertop where the saucepan had landed. The faint stick of dried gravy remained. It smelled faintly of tomato, spice, and something bitter. I ran my hand over it, pressing against the sticky residue. It was absurd, I thought. A moment so ordinary in its violence, yet it carried the weight of decades. I closed my eyes and let the kitchen fill me. Every sound, every smell, every tiny imperfection I had tolerated for years. I thought of Michael again, how he would come home, how he would see the evidence of what had happened, how he might finally understand the quiet suffering I had endured in his own home, in his presence. I sat at the small kitchen table. My fingers traced the grain of the wood. I remembered my husband, long gone, how he had always said the house would outlast us, and the walls would remember everything. I believed him then, but I had never imagined the walls would remember cruelty as sharply as they remembered love. I thought of Sophie, her youth, her anger, her impatience, her small tyranny, and for the first time, I allowed myself a small private acknowledgement of it. I hated what she had done. And I would not forgive it, not quietly, not silently. I pressed my palms to my eyes. The sting of the burn on my cheek felt distant now. The real ache was in my chest, where years of endurance had finally become too heavy to carry. I opened the kitchen window. The air was crisp, tinged with frost and the faint scent of roses from the garden. I took a slow, deep breath. I let the air fill me, shake me, remind me that the world outside my small house still moved, and that I could move with it. I had no plan, no list of words to say, no rehearsed confrontation, only a feeling that something had shifted. A kind of quiet strength, buried deep, had awakened. It was still fragile. It was still uncertain, but it was there. The house waited. The walls held their breath. And I, for the first time in decades, felt ready to stop holding mine. The house was silent, but the quiet wasn't peaceful. It was the quiet of anticipation. Of all the years I had endured, stacked like books on shelves that were always out of reach, each one marked by Sophie's small cruelties, each one catalogued in the corners of my mind like a ledger of grievances no one acknowledged. I thought about Michael again. How, even now, he would step into the kitchen and see me. Really see me. Not the soft, compliant woman I had trained him to expect, but someone who had reached the end of her patience. Someone who had felt the heat of injustice and finally refused to be invisible. The memories came to me in fragments, like light filtering through blinds. I remembered Christmases where I had worked for hours preparing the perfect meal, only for Sophie to critique the placement of the silverware. I remembered my birthday last year when Michael had wanted to celebrate quietly, but she had insisted it be rushed and flashy, ignoring my wishes. I remembered the subtle ways she asserted control, rearranging furniture I had lived with for decades, commenting on how I brewed tea, correcting my words as if I were a child. And I had said nothing. I had always believed that keeping the peace was worth more than my own comfort. But peace built on fear is fragile. I touched my cheek, where the gravy had landed. The red mark was almost gone now, but the sting lingered. It was a reminder, a warning, a sign that sometimes survival isn't about silence. I moved to the living room, where the sun had begun to rise fully, spilling light across the faded carpet. I ran my fingers over the edges of the sofa. The fabric was worn, soft in the places my hands had always rested, stretched where I had sat quietly, reading letters no one else cared to see. I thought about my own mother, long gone, and the lessons she had taught me without ever saying them outright. "You can endure," she had said once, "but there is a line you cannot cross without breaking yourself." I had lived my life on one side of that line, believing I was strong enough, but I had never known what it would take to cross it. Now I did. The memory of the gravy was sharp. Sophie's eyes, her cold precision, the way she had moved like she was untouchable, it all pressed against my chest. And yet, within that pressure, something had shifted. I could feel the quiet anger forming, like embers that had been buried under ashes. It was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was deliberate, calculated, patient. I let myself sink into it, recognizing it as power. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that awakens. The kind that reminds you you are alive, that your existence cannot be erased. I thought about Michael again, about the call, about the sound of his voice, uncertain, caring, protective. I had not asked for help, not directly, not in years, but I had let him come. And that small act of reaching out had shifted the balance of everything. The house creaked around me. A floorboard here, a pipe there, as though the building itself was reminding me of the years it had silently observed. I wondered if it had ever pitied me, if it had ever judged Sophie, or if it simply remembered, neutrally, every heartbreak and every sacrifice without bias or comment. I moved to the window and looked out at the garden. The roses had bloomed further now, the frost retreating under the sun's insistence. Even the smallest life finds a way to survive. Even the oldest walls contain the possibility of change. And I realized something crucial. I had survived too. I had endured, yes. I had swallowed, nodded, retreated, smiled politely. But I had survived. And the anger that burned quietly inside me was not weakness. It was fuel. Sophie would learn this, not today, not immediately, but the time would come when the choices she had made would meet consequence. I thought about the small details of my home, the teapot I had inherited from my mother, the photograph of Michael as a child, the clock that ticked steadily in the hall. Each object carried a memory. Each object was a witness. I let my hand rest on the photograph. Michael's young face smiled up at me. Unknowing, innocent. And I remembered why I had endured for so long. Not for Sophie, not for appearances, but for him. For the boy who had trusted me to be safe. For the man who might finally understand the weight I had carried. The kitchen smelled faintly of burnt toast from breakfast. I breathed it in, letting it mingle with the memory of the gravy. Life, I realized, had a way of layering the mundane with the extraordinary. Pain and beauty exist in the same space if you are brave enough to notice. I walked slowly through the house, touching surfaces as I passed. The banister, smooth under my hand. The dining table, scarred from decades of meals and conversations. The carpet, frayed but enduring. Everything had been here longer than me, and everything would continue after me. But I was here now, and I was awake. I thought about confrontation, not in a loud, dramatic way, but as a quiet, inevitable reckoning. Sophie could not undo the past. She could not erase her actions, and I could no longer endure them silently. I paused at the front door and looked at the world outside. The street was quiet, empty, except for a few cars passing slowly, people moving through their own lives. A breeze stirred the leaves on the trees, and I felt it on my cheek, warm and insistent. I understood then that this was not merely about the gravy, not merely about Sophie's cruelty. It was about every small injustice I had suffered quietly, every moment I had been made to feel less than I was, every second I had existed in the shadow of someone else's control. And I understood that I would no longer accept it. The phone call to Michael was not just a call for help. It was a declaration, a first step. I ran my hand along the wall as I moved back into the living room. The house felt alive now, awake with me. It hummed in a way it had not before, as though it recognized the shift, the quiet fire that had awakened in my chest. I sat down again, breathing slowly, feeling the pulse of anger and resolve mingle with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was not violent. It was deliberate, patient, and powerful. I would not remain invisible any longer. I would not shrink to maintain peace. I would not endure cruelty silently again. The house had witnessed decades of silence, but silence had ended today. The next steps would come. Michael would come. Sophie would face the consequences of her actions, and I would reclaim the space that had always been mine. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Not triumphant, not cruel, just resolute. I had survived. I had endured. And now I would act. The next day, the house felt different. Even before Michael arrived, I sensed the shift. The walls seemed to lean in, curious, aware. Every floorboard groan, every faucet drip. Every hum of the refrigerator felt sharper, charged with expectation. I walked to the kitchen, carefully avoiding the spots where the gravy had burned me the day before. The faint smell still lingered, faint but insistent, as though reminding me that some moments cannot be erased. Sophie was already there. She moved around the kitchen like she owned the air. Her hands cleaned surfaces meticulously, though the shine did little to mask the tension in her shoulders. She looked at me once, quickly. I could see the surprise flicker in her eyes. The faintest tremor of doubt. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Silence can be louder than anger, and I had learned its language well. I poured myself tea. The warmth seeped into my hands. The steam curled in the air, soft, almost forgiving. Sophie's movements became sharper, faster, almost desperate. I realized then that the woman who had thrown the gravy had underestimated me. She had assumed I would shrink. She had assumed that my quietness was weakness. It wasn't. The front door opened before I expected it. Michael's presence changed the room instantly. He stepped in with his coat half on, his tie loose, his expression somewhere between shock and restrained anger. His eyes found mine, a flicker of recognition, of relief, of protective resolve. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his voice carrying across the kitchen. I nodded. "I am now," I said quietly. Sophie froze. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Her hands stilled mid-motion. The air held its breath. Michael's gaze moved to her, steady and sharp. "What did you do?" he asked. Not yelling, not dramatic, but the calm force behind his words made the accusation heavier than any scream. Sophie's lips parted, searching for a defense. I saw her hesitate. A subtle shift, just enough to know that the balance had begun to tip. I didn't mean to," she began. Her voice faltered, fragile. Michael shook his head slowly. "You didn't mean to throw hot gravy at your mother?" His tone was soft, but each word was measured, deliberate. Sophie swallowed. Her cheeks reddened, not from embarrassment, but from fear. I watched, quiet, letting the space between us carry the weight of years. The years of small cruelty, of disregard, of being made invisible. The years of enduring silently, swallowing indignities that had grown heavier with each passing day. I, she stammered. No words could untangle the gravity of what had happened. Michael's gaze returned to me. "Are you okay?" he asked again. I met his eyes directly. For the first time in decades, I didn't flinch. I didn't hide behind quietness or politeness. I simply nodded. "I am," I said again. "And I will be." The silence stretched, unbroken, except for the subtle hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock. It was as if the house itself recognized a shift, acknowledging that some things could no longer be ignored. Sophie's shoulders slumped slightly, but she made no move to leave. Her defiance had faltered, but the tension in her body said she was not finished. Michael stepped closer to me, protective but steady. His hand rested lightly on my shoulder. "You shouldn't have to endure this," he said softly. The words were simple, but they carried decades of unspoken acknowledgement. I let myself absorb them, the warmth of his presence, the care in his voice, the knowledge that someone finally saw the truth. We didn't speak much after that. There was no need. The room had shifted. The tension lingered, but the invisible weight had lifted, if only slightly. Later, in the sitting room, I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in weeks. The afternoon sunlight poured through the curtains, painting the carpet in stripes of gold and shadow. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet embrace me. The house, alive with its own memory, seemed to settle around me, approving, steady. But I knew the rising moments were only beginning. Sophie's subtle manipulations had spanned years. Her smirks, her corrections, her cold politeness, all small acts of dominance. And now, confronted, she would adjust. She would plot. She would test boundaries in new, clever ways. I would not be naive. The next few days were a delicate dance. Sophie attempted to reclaim normalcy. She moved through the house with careful precision, as if nothing had happened. But her eyes betrayed her. I caught the flicker of tension, the micro-expressions of calculation. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. Her tone was clipped, rehearsed. I watched her, learning, measuring, waiting. Michael stayed close. He asked questions, subtle, not accusatory, but enough to make Sophie uncomfortable. He engaged with me differently now, his attention protective but balanced. It was clear that the shift in power had begun to ripple through the household. I began to reclaim small spaces of my life. The morning tea I made was no longer accompanied by nervous tension. I moved through the rooms with deliberate ease, testing the atmosphere. The house responded. Its creaks and groans seemed to echo my confidence. And then came the first real confrontation, quiet, tense, unavoidable. Sophie attempted to direct Michael in the kitchen. He politely refused. I observed silently. Her frustration grew, thinly veiled. She had underestimated the quiet strength I had cultivated. She had underestimated my son's awareness. I remained composed. Every small act of defiance, every slight, I catalogued in my mind. I would not lash out. I would not rise to drama. I would let the moment speak for itself. The house absorbed it all. The tension, the subtle confrontations, the quiet assertions of power. It listened. It remembered. Even the furniture seemed to respond, settling into place as if acknowledging the new balance of strength and patience. By evening, the household had shifted slightly. Sophie was quieter, less assured, her movements more calculated, her voice slightly more cautious. The air had changed, and I realized finally that this was just the beginning. The rising moments, the subtle confrontations, the unspoken threats, the quiet power plays, they were only beginning. I sat in my chair that evening, letting the warmth of the lamp wash over me. I felt the ache in my cheek from the previous day, the lingering sting of injustice, and the quiet fire that had awakened within me. It was a strange combination: pain and power, hurt and resolve. And I welcomed it, because for the first time in decades, I knew that silence was not the only option, that quiet endurance had limits, and that standing, fully present, could be its own kind of strength. The house hummed softly around me. The walls had witnessed the storm and had begun to adapt. Even the floorboards, weary from years of holding my small, careful steps, seemed to acknowledge that the rules had changed. And tomorrow, I knew, would bring more. More subtle confrontations, more tests, more revelations. But I was ready, because the quiet fire had been lit, and no amount of careful cruelty could extinguish it. The next morning, sunlight fell differently across the kitchen. It wasn't just light. It was a tension, sharp and revealing, the kind that exposes corners you've hidden from yourself. I moved slowly, deliberately, preparing breakfast. The kettle hissed, a companion to my thoughts. Sophie entered, cheerful, but her smile did not reach her eyes. It was the practiced kind, the kind that hides fear under politeness. I watched her carefully. Every small gesture spoke louder than words. The way she set the table, the way she avoided meeting my gaze, the way her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the teapot. I knew then. She had sensed the shift. She had realized, finally, that quiet endurance had a limit. Michael arrived shortly after, entering the kitchen with his usual measured steps. He had that look I had not seen in years: alert, protective, aware. I did not need to speak. The room held its breath. Sophie tried small talk, carefully neutral. I responded minimally, my tone polite but firm. I let the silence between us speak volumes. She flinched, as I had hoped. Michael's gaze flicked between us. He didn't intervene immediately. He didn't need to. The tension carried its own message. Later, I found myself alone in the sitting room. I traced the worn fabric of the sofa, feeling the history embedded in the threads. The house seemed to sigh around me, creaking softly, as if listening. I allowed myself to reflect, really reflect. on the years I had endured. I remembered small cruelties, slights and insults that had seemed minor at the time but accumulated into an invisible weight. The cold mornings when Sophie ignored my presence, the subtle corrections she offered with a smile, the quiet moments of exclusion at family gatherings. Each memory burned with a quiet fire, and now that fire was ready to speak. The first turning point came unexpectedly. Michael sat beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine. "You've endured too much, Mum," he said softly. I nodded, the truth of it pressing against my chest. "I know," I whispered. He looked into my eyes, steady and certain. "You don't have to endure anymore. Not her, not anyone." I let the words sink in. For decades, I had believed endurance was the highest form of strength. But now, I realized strength could take many forms. It could be quiet. It could be deliberate. It could be action, measured and inevitable. The next confrontation came when Sophie tried to assert herself, giving orders about the dinner. I stood, quietly firm. "I will prepare the meal my way," I said. Her expression tightened, the mask slipping for the briefest moment. She was not used to resistance, not in this house, not from me. Michael observed, silent but supportive. The tension was palpable, thick in the air, vibrating against the walls. Sophie faltered. Her voice, usually sharp and confident, became clipped, uncertain. I realized then that the smallest assertion could carry the weight of years of suppression. That dignity was not loud. It was steady. It was unyielding. Later, in the sitting room, Michael and I spoke quietly. He asked about the past, about the years of subtle cruelty, about the ways I had silently endured. I told him, softly, carefully, letting each word carry the truth of my experience. He listened, not as a son hearing complaints, but as a man understanding the depth of what I had carried. That night, I found myself standing in the hallway, listening. The house was quiet. Even Sophie had retreated to her room, subdued, careful. The tension of the day had left its mark. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. And then came the revelation. A letter I had discovered months earlier, tucked away in a drawer. A note from Michael's father, long gone, written in his careful, measured hand. It spoke of family, of expectations, of respect. And in it, I saw the blueprint of the strength I had inherited, the resilience that ran quietly through our blood. I held the letter close, feeling the warmth of memory and legacy. It reminded me that endurance was not weakness. It was preparation. It was training. For the moment when standing up was not just necessary, but inevitable. The following day, Sophie attempted to corner me again in the kitchen, offering a critique of my cooking. I paused, looked at her, and finally spoke. "My way, Sophie. I decide how things are done here." She blinked, momentarily speechless. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came. Michael appeared in the doorway, silently observing. The room was heavy with tension. But I felt calm, deliberate, empowered. For the first time in years, I realized that the small, quiet acts of defiance were as powerful as any outburst of anger. They carried weight. They carried history. They carried truth. Later, I sat in the living room, reflecting. The house hummed softly around me, alive with its own memory. The walls seemed to nod, the floors to acknowledge the presence of someone no longer willing to yield. I thought of the coming days. The confrontations would not end. Sophie would resist. There would be subtle manipulations, small tests, quiet threats. But I was ready. The fire within me burned steady and unyielding. I understood, finally, that patience had its limits, and when those limits were reached, action was inevitable. By evening, the air in the house felt lighter, charged with possibility. The smallest gestures, the quiet exchanges, carried meaning. Sophie's demeanour had shifted, the first cracks appearing in her armour, and in that I found hope. Hope not of vengeance, but of recognition. Recognition of the years I had endured, of the strength I had cultivated, and of the quiet, steady power that had always been mine. I would act, but not recklessly, not in anger, deliberately, quietly, inevitably. The house, patient witness to decades of endurance, seemed to approve. The floors, the walls, the windows, all remembered. And now they remembered a new kind of strength. The house was quiet that evening, not the soft quiet of peace, not the forgiving quiet of stillness, but the quiet of anticipation, the kind that hums under your skin, that makes every creak in the floorboard feel deliberate, meaningful. I sat at the edge of the sofa, the faded fabric rough under my hands. The kettle had long since cooled, leaving a faint metallic smell lingering in the kitchen air. I traced the pattern of the carpet with my eyes, noticing the small stains, the tiny frays. Each imperfection told a story. Each mark whispered of years, lived, endured, survived. Sophie's movements were soft now, careful, cautious. I could hear her in the kitchen, rearranging utensils, the subtle clink of cutlery echoing like a nervous heartbeat. She didn't look at me. Her gaze avoided mine, and yet I felt it, sharp and anxious. For the first time, her control faltered. I thought about Michael. He was upstairs, preparing himself for the call I had promised I would make. The call that would change everything. The call that would finally break the invisible chains Sophie had relied on for so long. I picked up the phone slowly. The receiver was cold against my palm. The screen glowed softly in the dim light of the living room. My fingers hesitated, hovering above the buttons. I could feel my heartbeat, steady and deliberate, like the tolling of a bell. Sophie paused in her movements. Even without looking, I knew she sensed it, the significance of what was about to happen. A quiet storm, gathering. Deliberate, patient. I dialed Michael's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring stretched across the room, across years of silence, years of endurance, years of quiet submission. When Michael answered, his voice was cautious, caring, aware. "Mum? Are you all right?" I paused before speaking, letting the gravity of my next words settle in the air. "I'm ready," I said softly, not afraid, not angry, but resolved. There was a pause on the line, heavy and full of unspoken understanding. "I'm here," he said finally, "and we'll face this together." The words were simple, but they carried decades of unspoken pain, the quiet endurance, the invisible suffering, the countless moments Sophie had tried to dominate, belittle, erase. I let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Michael, it's time she understands." Upstairs, I could hear Sophie moving, uncertain, nervous. Even the floorboards seemed to pause beneath her steps, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I felt a fire in my chest, not sudden, not furious, but steady, deliberate. Years of quiet submission had hardened into resolve. I was no longer invisible. I was seen. I was heard. And I would not relent. Michael's voice returned, steady and calm. "I trust you," he said, "and I know exactly what to do." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. It was enough. It was everything. Later, the sound of Sophie's voice drifted from the hallway. She was speaking to someone, probably herself, rehearsing words that would no longer have power over me. Her steps faltered as she realized the house had shifted. The quiet dominance I had cultivated had reached its inevitable conclusion. I hung up the phone, my hand steady, deliberate. The room seemed to exhale around me, the shadows shifting slightly as if approving the choice I had made. I moved through the house, each step deliberate. The furniture, the walls, the floors, they carried the weight of years of memory. But now, they carried something new, my resolve. Sophie appeared in the doorway of the living room. Her expression was cautious, wary, unsure. I met her gaze. Finally. No words were necessary. The silence was louder than any confrontation could ever be. It carried decades of endurance, years of quiet suffering, and the deliberate, patient power that had emerged from it. Michael entered behind her, his presence steady and protective. The air between us shifted, heavy, charged with quiet power. Sophie faltered, then sank slowly into the armchair I had claimed years ago as my own. Her smile was gone, her defiance dulled. She was aware, at last, that the house, the space, and its people had realigned. I breathed slowly, deliberately, letting the tension leave my body. The house hummed softly around me, settling into this new rhythm. The creaks and groans seemed to approve, acknowledging the quiet reckoning that had taken place. And then I sat. The sofa embraced me, worn fabric soft against my hands. The fading light of evening painted stripes of gold across the carpet. The house was alive with quiet memory, quiet understanding. I knew the storm was not over. There would be more tests, more subtle manipulations, more careful maneuvers. But I was ready. I had survived, endured, and finally, I had acted. The fire inside me was not destructive. It was steady, patient, deliberate. It would not be extinguished. And as the phone rested quietly on the table, still warm from my touch, I understood something important. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And sometimes that whisper changes everything. The house settled around me, the shadows lengthened, and I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. I had crossed the line I never thought I would. I had refused silence. And the next chapter of this life, the one where I was finally visible, finally heard, was waiting. The wind paused outside the window, as if listening, and I knew it would remember this moment, quietly, deliberately, forever. Thank you for watching. Your trust, your time, and your support truly mean everything. If this video brought you value, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps this channel reach those who need it most. Stay focused, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next video.